inside a sphere that's something like this. I can figure out, in this case it turns out it's 0, but it might not always be. Well, in the case of conductor it would be, but I can figure out what the contribution to that is. And then I can figure out a third contribution from the central charge. And in certain regions I have to add more than one component here. So in this region I only have this component. In this region I have these 2 components, and in this region I have these 3 components. And so effectively that's what's happening here. So I can do it either way. I can work with individual V expressions that come from 3 effective enclosed point charges, or I can work from the outside in, do the integral in terms of path lengths over electric fields, and I'll get the same answer either.
You still, when you said at the beginning of class, the negative positive integral, would the brackets not be negative in this case? What's in the brackets?
Let's see.
Still give the same answer.
So I've already, so what do I have here? My electric field is KQ over R squared. And then I have my negative E dot dl or d. So E ds. And then when I get this, I integrate it, I get minus 1 over r. Okay. So what you're highlighting now is the fact that I need to be careful in the direction that ds is relative to r. So in this case, okay, this is really, I'm actually going to talk about this in maybe about half an hour when we talk about capacitance. In this case, R is defined to increase as I go radially outwards. Okay, so R increases outwards. In this case, I'm choosing a ds that is going inwards if I'm coming from the outside in. So in that sense, relative to the R in here, which is defined from the inside out, it must be, it's a radial distance vector. This thing is in fact negative dr. Okay? So it's going in the opposite sense of the increasing R value.
Are you saying this case from A to R?
In this case, I'm going from A to a smaller R value inside, yes. I'm going against the sense of increasing R.
Wait, so just to like account for all the like negative signs, you have a negative out front to start. Then when you integrate, wouldn't you get another negative sign? But
Yeah.
then there's a third negative
In
sign?
this case, yes, because I'm choosing to go in against the direction of R.
And what are the bounds of integration explicitly?
From R equals A to some smaller R value. Okay, so this is going from A to R less than negative. Why this is negative?
So then wouldn't the delta V, wouldn't it be like flipped? Because you have 3 negatives, so that's a net 1 negative. So wouldn't that change the sign of delta V, A goes to R?
I think, let's see. So this is flipped, right? It's negative. Because otherwise I would have,
Like for the expression to the left of it though, like when you're evaluating the delta, like isn't that like negative then?
let's see. I've got 1, 2, you're right, that one's negative.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so you can see this is confusing. I'm not sure I helped make it less confusing right now. But I'm going to do one more example in a few minutes when we talk about capacitance that will reinforce this issue with the directional dependence. Joseph.
So in between B and A, we figure out that the potential is constant.
Feeling about 3 negative.
Okay, so I'm going to take just Joseph's question on this, and then I'm going to move on and we can talk more at the end of the class. So the question is, how do I know delta V is 0 in the conductor? So How do I know if delta V is 0? I want you to answer this.
Where the delta V is the chain, or is E times ds.
So how do we define change in the electric potential as I move through an electric field? Okay, I'm going to stand here. Not just because I want you to look at me over here, but because there's a clue. There's a clue.
Delta V is negative E ds.
Okay. So what do you know about the electric field in the conductor?
Electric field is 0.
Okay. So if I'm moving through a region where the electric field is 0, what do I know about this interval?
So the delta V is going to be 0, so the equals at V. There's no change in V from
Right. Right. Okay. All right. We'll do an example with capacitance in a little while, because it will reinforce this this case of when we're taking a path that is opposite the radial vector in a situation that has radial symmetry. All right. One last thing before we talk about capacitors. Leave that there for a while. Okay, I'm going to give you a chunk of conductor, and I'm going to embed it, in this case, in some external E field. Maybe it's uniform. So there's some external uniform E field, and I put a chunk of conducting material in it. It's electrically neutral. What can you tell me about the electric field inside a conductor? Okay, so I've got no E field inside. But we're talking about superposition of fields here. We always expect that to be valid. So in this case, how might I expect the conductor to respond in such a way that I have zero electric field inside?
Should it like produce an electric field with the opposite direction?
So, okay, I don't quite know how I'm going to describe this. We'll call it kind of induced electric field. How might it do that? How must it do that?
Radius charge, such as
So I should expect, in cases where I drop this thing embedded in some outside electric field, that there's going to be some charge migration, which you can think of as setting up an electric field that's in the opposite direction, of course, and such that when I add the two together, I get no net electric field inside the conductor. Yes, right, plus is on this side. So this is coming from positives. So I must set up some internal electric fields equal and opposite. Okay? So indeed, that's what we expect to happen. Now, you might recall from last week, we had that demonstration with the radio, picking up radio waves. This is kind of an illustration of this. This is a purely static electric field, as we'll learn about in a few weeks. We can form time-varying electric fields, and it turns out if we do so, they're associated with time-varying magnetic fields, things we call electromagnetic waves. And so that's what radio waves are. And so what's happening when we saw the radio signal disappear when I covered it with a metallic enclosure is essentially this, but not in a static scenario, everything here would be static, but in a case where it's dynamic, things are moving. And what you can think of as the extension is to those cases where the electric field is changing in time. It means there's a kind of variable inducing of charge on the surfaces here, such that the electric field inside is always zero. So that's effectively what was happening in the case with that demonstration of the electromagnetic shielding we saw with the radio set. So just one footnote that I wanted to mention when we're talking about this in electric fields, external electric fields. It's very much analogous to the situation we saw a few moments ago with induced charge within conductors setting up. So again, the electric field inside is always zero. Okay, so let's change direction and start talking about capacitance, and then if there's still some questions about this, just at the end we'll come back and talk about it. All right, so capacitors. We're going to start transitioning now from fairly abstract stuff to much more concrete stuff and practical applications of the sort of concepts we've been talking about. And so talking about capacitors is the first step in that. So what are we talking about here? So we're going to talk about the concept of capacitance and its realization in devices called capacitors. Okay. So, what is the concept? If you think of many of the cases we've talked about so far, we are setting up electric fields in certain regions of space, and it turns out that we can essentially store energy in that process. So probably the primary use of capacitors is as energy storage devices. And the fact that we have an electric field set up in a region between two charged objects, they tend to get called plates generically, because the standard geometry of a capacitor is sort of two parallel plates. So we're going to make use of this primarily as an energy storage device. It turns out there are other very useful features of such devices when they're combined with other things in circuits. In particular, they can, in a controlled way, introduce time-dependent behaviors. So, sort of somewhat conceptually, but also a very sort of simple practical realization of what this might look like. Something that looks like this. Two parallel plates, shape doesn't matter, they're often circles. And I could imagine somehow setting up equal and opposite charges on these. These are conducting plates, typically. So I can move charges around at will. And what you would expect now is if I look at the electric field associated with such a setup, at least within the interior here, I'm expecting a uniform electric field from left to right in this case. In reality, there's some kind of spreading of field lines around the edges. We'll often ignore this, but we kind of know that this must be true. Something like this. Well, the question of what happens out here, I should be a little bit careful about. I'm claiming that these are conductors. So let me just leave these as kind of suggestive for now, and then we'll explore what actually happens in just a moment. So this would be a simple geometry for a parallel plate capacitor, and we can store energy in this electric field. So we're going to talk mostly about these being having either nothing in the middle or a good approximation of nothing. For our purposes, it's going to be air. So these are either vacuum or air filled capacitors. We'll spend a bit of time on Tuesday next week talking about what happens if we intentionally put something other than air in here, and what effect that has on these devices. But for now, we're just going to talk about air. All right, so we're going to need to figure out, first off, how do I establish such a setup? So a little bit backwards here, because we're going to talk about this next week primarily. But imagine that these are conducting plates, and these are simply conducting connections. They're wires, if you will, maybe copper wires. How could I set up such a scenario? What we're going to make use of, and again, this is jumping a little bit ahead to next week, is basically a battery. And for our purposes for now, a battery is simply a source of constant potential difference delta V, okay? We will define this next week, but you kind of know this already. If you use a battery, you are used to picking up batteries and you'll see things like, I don't know, 9 volts on them. Obviously it's talking about a defined potential difference. And of course batteries have 2 connections, what we call 2 poles, 2 terminals. That's a source of defined potential difference between those 2 terminals, okay? So where does that come from? We'll talk about this next week, chemical energy essentially. But its primary purpose is to maintain a constant delta V across its terminals. So if I was to take one of these devices and simply hook it up down here, maybe I'll start to introduce a little bit of circuit terminology, because we will start using that today. So batteries in circuit symbols are typically represented by something that looks like this. So again, 2 vertical lines, one of which is going to be called the positive terminal of the battery, the other is going to be called the negative terminal, and there's a delta V provided between these 2 terminals, okay? So, think about what would happen if I now took such a device and connected it with a conducting pathway, namely wires, could be copper wires as an example of a good conductor. I've got something here which has a positive potential, and then I'm connecting it relative to this, and connecting this to a chunk of electrically neutral conductor, metal. What do you think is going to be the effect, ignore this for just a moment, what is going to be the effect on this chunk of conductor over here if I have a positive potential here and a negative potential here? So think about, this is electrically neutral, but you can think of it as being made up of equal numbers of positive and negative carriers. What's going to happen? Yeah?
We're going to get migration of charges.
Right, we're going to get migration of charges. So in a sense, again, think of this that I have equal numbers of 3 positives and 3 negatives on this left-hand side. Where are the 3 negatives going to tend to want to move if I look at the left-hand side of this? So, right, so the negatives are going to tend to migrate this way, which leaves us with a net positive over here. And of course, you can think of that as a tendency to repel positives. So this would work in terms of giving me a net positive charge on this plate. And of course, by symmetry, I've got a negative pole over here. It's going to tend to attract 3 positives on this side down here. It's going to tend to push away 3 negatives or leave them in place, depending on how you want to think about this. So I could imagine setting up a scenario like this by connecting it to a constant potential difference supply, aka a battery. So that's how this would be set up. And it turns out, as we do this, we find a simple relationship. Well, first off, if you think about this, it's going to reach some equilibrium at some point, probably, because as I bring more and more negatives over here, essentially I'm mitigating the positive charge here. It's getting smaller and smaller in terms of its effect. Inversely over here. So eventually I'm going to expect there's a kind of equilibrium scenario. And no big surprise, it's when I have delta V established between the plates of the capacitor. So in fact, I end up having delta V across here as well. Okay, that's when I reach standing equilibrium. So, if I do this, it turns out that I see there's a proportionality between the amount of charge built up on these plates and the potential difference that's established between them. So what I see here is that Q is proportional to delta V. Okay? And all I need to do when I've got a scenario like this is replace the proportional sign with a constant. And this is where we immediately introduce the idea of capacitance. And that's how we define the capacitance of such a setup. Okay? So we now just introduced the idea of a simple geometry capacitor. It's a device that has equal and opposite charges on two things we call plates. This is the parallel plate geometry. This is what we observe empirically. And this is how we can make this an actual equation by throwing in a constant of proportionality. This is the capacitance. Okay. So, now we've got this. There's a slightly, I don't know, just something to be aware of. There's a slightly frustrating change of variable very often at this point in standard text, which is implicitly, of course, or explicitly here, this is a difference in potentials. For ease of notation, very often, you'll find textbooks at this point often drop the delta and just define this as a potential difference V. Okay? Try not to be confused by this, or it's not helpful the way that it's standardly done. This is a potential difference, but delta is often dropped. Okay, so when we talk about a 9-volt battery, it's a 9-volt potential difference between the two terminals. But you'll often see it simply as V equals 9 volts. Okay, so the delta is inclined to disappear at this point, and so you may see this as simply Q equals CV. All right. So in terms of units, as always, when we're starting to introduce some new concept, we need to worry about units. So let me just go over here. Now I can define C as Q over V. So coulombs over volts, if you will. And as this is a commonly used quantity in electrical circuits, we're going to define a new unit here. So coulombs over volts is also defined as farads. Okay, so we've now got a new unit of farad. 1 farad is 1 coulomb over 1 volt potential difference. In terms of practical devices, 1 farad is a pretty hefty capacitance. And devices that are used most commonly in, let's say, electrical or electronic devices tend to be of the level of maybe microfarads or less, so 10 to the minus 6, 10 to the minus 9, that sort of level. So now we've got this concept of capacitance. Let me just go a little bit further and start introducing some sort of circuit diagram symbols, because we are going to start talking about circuits. So, I think what I'm inclined to do, since I do kind of still want to leave that there, is maybe just pull this down. Okay, so battery, so this is a source of constant delta V. The symbol for this I've just drawn is that. capacitor reflects the standard parallel plate geometry. You want to be careful in distinguishing this from the battery device above. So it typically is drawn like this. So two equal length parallel lines, parallel plates with a connector. These lines here are simply connectors. They are assumed to be perfect conducting connectors. So let me just call them perfect conductors for now. And the last thing we're going to worry about, just for the time being, is the concept of a switch. And you'll often see this written in circuit as something that looks something like this. So there's a break in what's otherwise a conductor, kind of possibility to switch this thing so it's open or closed. Okay, so you can imagine that this thing goes back and forwards and either makes or breaks a contact. Okay, so those are some of the initial circuit symbols we're going to worry about. So let me just give you a sense of some of the, or one of the standard ways such a device might be used. So why might we want to take the device, one of these capacitors, and store energy in it? So very often we want to build up a large amount of energy that we can access rather quickly. And so batteries, well, of course they're a supply of potential difference in the sense that they're therefore a supply of potential energy. But there's a sort of certain limit to what batteries can provide, and they have to provide them consistently over an extended period of time. If instead I have an application where I need to access large amounts of energy in a short space of time, capacitors are useful. I can use them to store up energy by charging them up, essentially by making the circuit here, which I close with a battery, storing energy over time on this, separating it from the battery, and then instantaneously, more or less, releasing the stored energy. Okay? So, what sort of scenarios have you seen cases where that happens? Isaac? Flash photography is a really common one. So, it's you don't notice it these days, and you guys are young enough that you probably never used cameras where this used to be something that you could actually observe. But back in the day, when you had flashes on cameras and you wanted to take a flash photograph, it would take you a decent amount of time to turn on the flash and have it charge. And in fact, you could often hear it. These days, that's not really the case. But for example, here, if I want to take a photograph using a flash, what I'm essentially doing when I set up my camera now to do this is I'm storing energy in a capacitor, and at a particular instant when I take the photograph, did that flash? I don't think so. Okay. That's a bit much, but let me show you a more dramatic example. Same device, this is a capacitor. It doesn't have a parallel plate geometry now, it's a cylindrical geometry, which I'm still hoping to get to. It's big. We'll see in just a moment, size generally correlates to larger capacitance. It means it can store a hefty amount of energy. So all I'm going to do now is exactly what I said. I'm going to take, in this case, a power supply, use it to charge up a capacitor, and then use the stored energy in a rather rapid way. So let's see if I can do this. So that's the power supply, make a connection. So I'm now using essentially a powerful battery here to charge up this capacitor. So I've made a connection. It's a switch. You saw me open and close it. That's what I'm doing there. Connecting wires, battery, capacitor. This is the simplest possible circuit I can build with those four components. All right. So there it is. At this point, this has been charging for maybe 15, 20 seconds. In principle, there's a decent amount of energy stored. And I can store it essentially indefinitely. So I'm turning this off, I'm breaking the connection, but in principle I've stored a decent amount of electrical energy in here. I'm now going to put a connecting contact between the two poles, the two sides of this capacitor, and see what happens.
No.
Okay, so that's essentially what's happening with your flash photography in a slightly more controlled way, okay?
You okay?
So energy storage devices. I'm going to post for you guys a quick online video reference to the facility here in the US, a research facility in the US called the National Ignition Facility. It has to do with nuclear fusion and